Good morning and welcome to our seminar on preparing for ransomware. I was talking to my wife about this morning, that we were going to do a seminar on ransomware, and she kind of laughed and said you couldn't have picked a more relevant topic. If you've been watching the news, you've seen where the city of Wichita is struggling with ransomware right now. You may have also seen where a major hospital in the area is likewise struggling with ransomware. And then there's lots of other organizations around the state who have also been fighting the scourge. So if we're talking about ransomware, what in the world do we need to do to protect from it? And how can we help ourselves be ready? Now, a couple of housekeeping things before we get into the webinar this morning. First off, this is recorded, and there will be links sent out about how you can see the recording and get that. Likewise, most of the notes that are here are compiled into a presentation or into a handout, which you will be receiving in an email shortly after this is over also. So there's a lot to go over. Our goal is to make this about a 20-minute webinar and then to leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions. If you have questions during the event, feel free to use the Q&A box up at the top. Sean is going to be monitoring the Q&A box for us and helping run that. So as different questions come up, feel free to go ahead and type those in, and we'll go ahead and take a look at those as we come down closer to the end of the webinar. But let's start out. If we're talking about ransomware this morning, probably the first question that all of us need to set back and begin with is the question, what exactly is ransomware? Well, ransomware goes by a couple of different definitions, but here's what we're going to use for our purposes this morning. That ransomware is going to be a type of malware that encrypts files and then demands a payment to restore access. A lot of people are under the mistaken thought that if you simply pay the ransom, you'll get all your stuff back. But there's two problems with that. Number one, can we really trust a thief? And so there have been lots of cases where people have paid the ransom and then either received a bad decryptor key or no decryptor key at all or something like that. So even though they paid maybe multiple millions of dollars, they were still unable to restore their data. The second problem with that is that if your thief has downloaded a bunch of data as part of the ransom, they will likely go ahead and sell that on the dark web or make it available anyhow. So even though you paid the ransom, and even if you got your data decrypted, you can't guarantee that you actually protected it all. You may have exposed hundreds or even thousands of clients and have all their information out there available on the dark web because of what happened to you. It was interesting. We received notice just this morning from a vendor that they too had been hit by an attack like this and notifying us that their data was out on the dark web and stuff. The second thing we're going to say about what ransomware is, though, is that it often comes by clicking a link in a bad email or on a bad website. Ransomware is one of those unique things where the human element is really important. And so if we can get our users to understand how ransomware comes in, most often through a bad email, or by surfing someplace on their work computers, Facebook, who knows where else, clicking on an ad, those often can download ransomware too. And so we're talking about stuff that often comes as a result of some action that a user does. We'll come back to that topic in just a few minutes. But also when we talk about what ransomware is, it's interesting to note that as you look at statistics, and these statistics are going to come from the URL that is at the bottom of your slide from Varonis. When you look at statistics, right now the average cost for a ransomware incident is $1.85 million. I don't know about you, but that would more than break my budget personally. A $1.85 million that put us, we couldn't handle it. And on top of that, the average cost being $1.85 million per incident, also the average ransomware incident leads to a business being down for an average of 22 days. Now, just think through your organization. If you were down and had no income and no business for 22 days, could you survive? What would happen? Would you be able to recover? Interestingly enough, there are a lot of companies that are hit by ransomware, a lot of businesses that are never able to recover just because of these costs like that. So as we begin, we're talking about something that has a really major potential impact for your organization. That's something that could honestly damage your organization almost irreparably. So if we know that that's there, and we know that this risk exists, how do we go about preparing for it so that we can avoid it or so that we can manage it in some way? What do we do? I'm going to present 5 steps. These are the major 5 that I see as I've talked with people and worked with them. The first thing to understand when we talk about preparing for ransomware is that this is going to be a risk that your board or your chief executives have to buy into. And they have to buy into it because the cost for preparing to defend against it is far less than the cost of trying to walk through the incident. So for example, if we're talking about an incident with an average cost of 1.85 million, if we're talking about a type of risk where the average business is down for 22 days, those are topics that your board or your executive should know. Those are statistics that your board or executive should understand, so that as they think about, do we spend money on ransomware preparation or not, they can understand that this is the risk we're talking about. Another stat that I did not put in because I couldn't find the definitive background for today, but I've seen data that shows that in any given year, you've got between a 20 and 25% chance of getting hit by ransomware. So if you take that 1.85 million cost and you amortize it across a potential risk of 5 years, you can see that your potential per year risk is $400,000 roughly. That's something that your board and executives should look at. And if your risk cost is $400,000, and yet you're only going to spend $15,000, $10,000, whatever, to prepare for it, that's a pretty good return on investment for a person to have. These numbers are also made more real when you use certain tools that are out there. One that I like to help show the risk that an organization faces is from the Chubb Cyber Index, and using the Chubb Cyber Index Cyber Risk Calculator. I'd like to take just a minute to demo this for you so that you can see how this works. So let me take just a minute to get my screen shifted around here on this. Okay, Chubb Cyber Risk Calculator. Okay, so this comes from the Chubb Insurance Group, and they're a major cyber insurance risk management group. That's who we ourselves have our insurance through, and others do. And so when you look at the Chubb Cyber Index, they let you calculate in a real-time method what your potential risk is. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. We're going to go ahead and hit enter, agree to the terms. We're going to choose Cyber Risk Calculator over here on the left. And when we choose the Cyber Risk Calculator, it allows us to walk down through our industry and just figure out a little bit. So since there was a major healthcare organization hit by ransomware in Wichita yesterday, let's choose that just for fun. And let's say that we're going to say that we'll just pick some kind of a healthcare facility. We'll leave it like that. And let's say that we've got an average revenue. This is going to be small for a lot of them. Let's say 10 mil. All right. And if we're a healthcare facility, let's say we've got number of patient records, 5,000. I know that's probably small, but let's use that. So if I update my calculation on those parameters, Chubb estimates that our average risk for that is going to be roughly 2.5 million. Now, the interesting thing about that 2.5 million is that does not actually include all of the costs that you may end up happening. But notice at the bottom, it shows your business interruption costs. Not all cyber insurance policies cover business interruption. We've had the opportunity to look at a whole bunch of them over the last year, and that's not been in everything that is there. So that's a tool that is pretty helpful, and it can help you as you make your case before your executives or your board, whichever you have, as you talk about what the risk is and how you're going to go ahead and try to prepare and get ready for it. So let's come back to our discussion then. So if we can use the cyber risk index, we can use the Chubb Cyber Risk Index Calculator to help us get an idea of what's going on and what our potential risk is. And I personally think that's a very good tool. But as you're looking at cyber insurance, a lot of organizations think, well, I have cyber insurance that will cover everything that I have to do if I get hit by ransomware. That's not true. Cyber insurance often only covers a portion of the cost, and that comes from a couple of different ways. Sometimes it comes because cyber insurance, maybe you wrote it for $1 million and your total costs come out to be 10 mil. Sometimes cyber insurance only covers a portion because you've got all these deductibles that are in there. Sometimes a person or an organization doesn't go through all the right steps that insurance wants. And so because of that, insurance won't go ahead and cover the entire costs that are there. But there's also another reason, which I see a lot of times. Cyber insurance may not cover everything because they may have their own requirements. Depending on your policy, some of your cyber policies may have certain requirements that you have to have. Things like multi-factor authentication or things about guaranteed backups and certain things. And if you have not met those prerequisites for your cyber insurance policy, it is quite likely that insurance will use that as a reason for not to pay. So as we prepare for ransomware, step number one, we need to get board and executive buy-in before we're going to do this. But step number two, as we prepare for cyber insurance, we need to prepare our network. Now, I'm assuming as we go through this that your organization is doing regular updates, okay? That you're updating your Windows, your Mac, your Android devices, your firewalls have current signatures, all those kinds of things. I'm assuming that base is there. If that's not, that's the absolute first thing you need to do, even though it's not listed on the slide here. But because ransomware often comes in either through email or through clicking on a bad link on a website, one of the first things we need to do is to implement high-level email filtering and URL scanning. Now, I fully realize everybody likes cheap, okay? I fully realize everybody likes cheap. And when we talk about email, everybody likes cheap email. I understand that completely. But what most people don't understand is that cheap comes with a very expensive cost. And in this case, the very expensive cost is that if you're getting cheap email filtering, that means, or cheap email service, that means they're not going through the steps to filter your emails for URLs that are bad, to scan for infected attachments, or to do any of those things to protect you. And yet, because email is your #1 vector by which ransomware enters your organization, if you're going to say, we want cheap email, and yet that is the highest risk factor, that's a pretty expensive cheap email service that you've got. So as we talk about preparing our network against ransomware, first thing we're going to talk about is implementing email protection with URL scanning and affected attachments. Yes, it costs more. No, it is not free, but yes, it is worth the money. The second thing we're going to talk about there is that we also implement high-level endpoint protection. So by endpoints, we're talking about your Windows computers or your Mac computers or your Androids, those that are out there that your people use, that you use. Once again, everybody likes free. And so it's not uncommon for us to see organizations that want to use free antivirus or cheap antivirus. Well, there's a couple of problems. First off, free antivirus almost always, I've never seen this happen otherwise. Every free antivirus license terms I've ever looked at always says that free is not available for use in businesses. #1 issue. The #2 issue, free is not going to have all your most current protections and all your most current stuff. So yes, does it cost more? But yes, is it worth it? We use Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection. They recently rebranded that, but that's our go-to for implementing higher security. If you want to talk about that more, drop me a note when the webinar is over and we can freely chat about that. But besides implementing email filtering, high-level endpoint protection, the third thing as we prepare our network is to implement policies and procedures to keep staff off sketchy websites. It is okay to implement staff policy that says you can't use your work computer to go surfing, etc. It is okay to use your firewall to implement content filtering policies so that all sorts of different sites aren't allowed to be accessed on your business network. Because we talked about how email being the #1 entry point for ransomware, but the #2 entry point is clicking on links on sketchy websites or ads. So as we talk about preparing our network, we implement policies and procedures to protect everybody from clicking on sketchy stuff like that. #3, the third most important thing we can do as we prepare for ransomware is that we can create a backup and a recovery plan that we know works. When I talk about that, that really includes 4 phases: that we're going to develop it or plan what we want, that we're going to turn around and implement the backup plan, and then we're going to test to be sure that what we think we backed up really can be recoverable. I've seen cases where people thought they were backing up a complete system and discovered that a folder or a set of files were unavailable and didn't get included in the backup. Seen things where the backups were being made only to discover when they tried to restore that the removable media was no longer good and so no longer had data that could be recovered. So as we develop it and we implement it and then we test to be sure we can recover, we need to then monitor that backup recovery plan. Software fails, updates make things break. And so we have to constantly watch this stuff to be sure that the backups that we're making are indeed doing what we think they should do and that they are indeed running regularly. But also when we make backups, we need to follow the current 321 backup standard. The current 321 backup standard says that we're going to have 3 copies of our data. Now, I know I've talked to people who think that's an awful lot of copies. Why should we need it? And believe me, I've seen many times when the primary backup wasn't available, a secondary backup copy saved our bacon. Okay, so we make 3 different copies of our data in places. But on that 3 different copies of data, we use at least 2 different media. A lot of people don't realize that removable media like flash drives or removable disks, they have a limited lifespan. So you need at least 2 different kinds of media, maybe a hard drive someplace and a backup or whatever. And along with that, at least one of those media should be in the cloud, so it's off-site, so that it is away from your organization. Reason is, a lot of your ransomware now goes around and tries to delete your backups. So if you're leaving your removable drive always attached to your computer, you can almost guarantee that when ransomware hits, it's going to delete the data on your removable drive because it's attached to your computer. So sticking one in the cloud gives us that air gap, if you will, that protection. But along with that air gap protection, we also want to use what's called immutable backups. Immutable means it can't be changed. This is kind of a newer option that's available. And if you want to talk about backups more and how to use immutable, give us a holler. Our team would be happy to help you out on that. But by writing data to your immutable backups, you're guaranteeing that ransomware is able to A, get in there and delete the stuff, or B, infect the backups with ransomware again so that it just recovers when you restore. So immutable backups are definitely worth the money and worth the effort. And then once you get your plan and everything created, you're going to regularly test your backups so that you know what you've got is working like you think. 4th step, as we prepare for ransomware, is to take a look at our cyber insurance. Now, we've seen all kinds of cyber insurance policies out there. Some policies basically say we cover it and have really no specifications. Some policies have really, really low coverage amounts, what they get in there. And I understand that everybody wants cheap cyber insurance. I know that. But once again, this is one of those cases where you get what you pay for. So if you buy really cheap cyber insurance, you probably are getting what you pay for. A couple of things that I would encourage you to look for as we think about cyber insurance is that #1, I would want you to know if your cyber insurance has certain network requirements you have to maintain. I understand reading through the fine print can get tedious. I know that. But if your cyber insurance has certain requirements, like I've seen policies that require you to use MFA on everything. If you've got policies that have certain requirements and you're not meeting those, you can guarantee that they're not going to cover you when you come to an event and a situation. So know if your cyber insurance policy has network requirements. Likewise, take a look at your cyber policy. Sometimes your cyber policies, Chubb would be one of them that we just talked about. Sometimes your cyber policies, your insurer will offer resources at cheap or discounted rates to help you stay safe. It's in their interest to negotiate good rates so that you can use these tools. So I would contact your carrier and see exactly what they have. And then the third thing I would ask with regard to cyber insurance is that I would understand what my requirements are in the event of an incident. Most of your cyber policies have a requirement that if you are hit by an incident, that you have to contact them first, and then they basically manage the recovery process. So I've seen places where people got hit by ransomware, where they, in all good faith, tried to go through things themselves to make the recovery. And then because they hadn't contacted their insurance first, their insurance carrier either A, greatly reduced what they would pay out to help that, or B, wouldn't pay anything out at all. So my recommendation is that in a cyber incident, stabilize the system. That may be as simple as pulling the plug so the ransomware is locked. Do whatever, stabilize, and then contact your carrier and follow their guidance for recovery. Our cyber insurance, our organization, is through Chubb, and they state plainly in their policy that if we use policies and practices outside of what they have, if I remember right, it cuts their help by 50%, cuts their payback by 50%. So it's worth it to know what your policy states. Fifth thing, last, I would develop a plan. I would encourage every company to develop a plan, and that plan involves how you're going to recover. That includes assigning responsibilities, like who's going to be responsible for various things to get stuff in place to make it work, contacting the insurance company, contacting whatever legal you have, any of those different things in your incident response plan. But along with that, what a lot of times people miss in the incident response plan is that you need to know how to procure new hardware. There was a cyber incident within the past month here in the state of Kansas where the malware that hit actually destroyed the hardware. And so this massive public safety organization had to bring on all new servers and hardware and rebuild this whole system from scratch all the way up. That took time to get new hardware in and new stuff in. And if your organization is using some kind of equipment, like some OT equipment, for example, that may be older and hard to replace, or PLCs, or a special version of Windows, 1,001 things, know how you're going to handle those particular uniquenesses so that you can make plans to recover your processes. We've already talked about this, to understand your cyber insurance processes, as they want to be involved in helping you recover. But what a lot of people miss also is that you need to know your legal responsibilities. If you're under some kind of guidelines, everything from the FTC safeguard rules to notification laws from various states, if you're in one state, but you've got customer records from a different state that puts you under their responsibilities, all of these things may come into play as you prepare for recovery and how you're going to work. And so along with that, you need to begin planning your communications to all of your stakeholders. Everything from your customers are going to want to know how in the world do they pay their bills now that your systems are down, to media that wants to know how many records were released and how bad things were and how long it's going to take to recover. And all these things can take a lot of time. Just look at the Kansas judicial system and how many months that whole process has been ongoing. So there's a lot going on. Now, I've got something for you. If you were on this webinar, you're going to receive an email shortly that's going to have a copy of this document with you. Basically, it covers most of the points that we had. If you're watching this webinar on YouTube, you'll find the link in the information box below on how you likewise can get a copy of this handout. And you may find that this is useful as you plan and as you help make your case before your leadership teams on why and how you should prepare for ransomware. Now, I'm sure there's some questions. If you have questions, feel free to type them into the question and answer box there on Teams. There's going to be a webinar replay available coming out an email to you guys that were on live. It will be posted shortly to our Practical Cybersecurity YouTube channel. You can get that there. The summary handout will be available at this link that you see, and likewise, you guys live are going to find it. If there are any questions, our phone number, email contact, web access, that we'd love to hear any questions and be able to help you out if there was anything that came to your mind. Okay, so as we've talked through this, I know this is a huge topic for all of us to consider. Does anybody have any questions or any comments about this as we brought it that you'd like to add into the Q&A box? Any thoughts? Now's your time, guys. Okay. Well, then, for every one of you that attended, I want to thank you very much for being here this morning. We're going to be offering these webinars on a monthly basis for free. Feel free to, yes, Shauna just put into the chat box and typed in a note about please put your questions here. Karen, thank you very much. I'm glad you found the webinar very helpful. If we can help you out as you prepare for ransomware, give us a shout. You've got our contact information there. And for all of you that were on, thank you very much for attending. I really appreciate you taking the time. All right, goodbye.